In today's video, we'll be looking into Brahms's Intermezzo. I know it's been a while since I've submitted and uploaded the last video, but I would like to, continue with this project because I think it's valuable. I've received a lot of validation through your emails and comments. And if you would like to support these videos, if you like them, if you'd like to see them on a more regular basis, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon, and also consider, acquiring some of the digital products that are available, like the PDF files of these analysis and so forth. So the piece that we have here is one of the late masterpieces by Brahms, and it's not long in scope, but it's very dense in terms of details. So what we will do is we'll start with an overview of the broad structure of the piece, and then we'll begin with the analysis and study of the first phase. So what is the main form of this, or like the large scale structure? Well, we have a section A at the beginning. This section A is in the key of E major, and it's basically the first page, right? After that, we clearly have a second section, which is section B, and it is in the key of G sharp minor. Now, G sharp minor is the relative of the dominant. If you remember the neighbor keys or tonalities that we have in E major, we have E major, we have its dominant, which is B, and the B major as a dominant of E has a relative key, and the relative minor key of B major is G sharp minor. So we have this section, which is probably one of the most beautiful textures ever written for a piano, and after that we go back to E major. So this is a recapitulation, and it's section A prime. It's a variation of section A. All right, this section, in spite of being a repetition of A, has very interesting modulations and tonalizations, so we will be covering those too. Let's go and play the first phrase, the first formal unit that we have, that will just go from A till the fermata sign. So what do we have here? We have a clear modulation to C sharp major, because the next formal unit that begins here is in C sharp major, and it starts like this. And after that, we get A again. That will be the cadence, and that's the transitional chord. Right? So we will label that the section ends there, and here we have this connecting chord. All right, so as we can see, section A inside of it is also articulated as a ternary form. We could use small case labels to indicate this. So that would be AA, AB, and A prime. Right. Now, let's look into the first A. The first A clearly has 4 phrases, or at least that's what Brahms tries to tell us through the slurs that we have. So I want to highlight maybe this with a slightly larger stroke. Let's maybe put orange here. So that's the larger separation, and then we will be using a smaller stroke for the smaller ones, maybe with green. So we have this phrase, we have another one here, and yet another one there. 4 phrases. Now, what type of form or musical structure do we have? In this case, we could be contemplating the phrases as a sequential pattern, because if we look into what's really happening from the melodic perspective, it all begins with this high B, and it keeps going down, and after this we arrive to E and C sharp eventually, right? So the descending line, I think it's very clear, and it's one big formal unit. We can highlight it here and see how it keeps going down. At the same time, this scale begins again on a slightly higher interval. So we have now C sharp, and it goes to G sharp. All right, so let's try to make sense of what we're seeing. If we are looking into the beginning, I would probably highlight the ES as a point of arrival. We're having a phrase that goes from the dominant, so we have here, we can label it with 5, to the tonic, or the first note of the scale, in E major. However, the second time we're going from the 6th to the 3rd. It doesn't make much sense thought that way, but if you think of it like an arrival from the tonic to the dominant in C sharp, then that would make lots of sense. And C sharp is what? It's the relative key. And it's really where we're going. So this cadences, this ending, it's a perfect authentic cadence in C sharp major. C sharp major is the parallel relative. Right? So we have 2 types of relative keys. We have the relative minor. So E major has C sharp minor as a relative key because both share the same key signature, but C sharp minor can have its parallel key, which is C sharp major. Right? In a way, when this cadence happens, it sounds almost like a Picardy third. You have a minor sonority, but at the last moment, the minor chord becomes major. So we can highlight this. It's a Picardy third, and it's a really important note from the structural point of view. So let's put it with blue. Picardy third. Right. So that would be primarily the melodic outline of the top part, and as we can see, it's this sequential pattern. First it's a scale, then it's taken a step higher, but the roles structurally are inverted. First we go from dominant to tonic, then we go from tonic to dominant. Right, let's try to understand it from the perspective of the types of phrases or periods that we have. I would consider this primarily as a period, because we're having an opening idea that I will highlight here with yellow, which is this. And this opening idea is repeated again. So that repetition of the opening idea, it's really important from the structural perspective. We have this opening idea. You can put it here, OI, and we have the repetition of this opening idea a second above, second higher. So by doing this, Brahms basically gives more coherence and grants this structural repetition. Now, at the same time, we have a contrasting idea, which is first presented here, and then it becomes a cadential idea. So this would be the contrast, and that would be the cadence. Of course, if we're looking into this as a period, it's a modulating period. So it's a period with a modulation to the parallel relative, as we saw it there. And this period, well, is very symmetrical. It's very standard because it has 8 bars that are articulated in 4 plus 4, which inside are subdivided by 2 plus 2. In both cases. Right. So that would be the structural form. Now, let's look into the harmony, because harmonically there are clearly quite unusual choices that make this beautiful melody. So the first thing that we can see is that the harmony begins with, and we'll be using black for this, with a tonic. And the tonic is clearly moving to a chord that's written very interestingly, because the way that it's perceived, or at least it's heard, is like an A minor chord with a major 7th and a 9th, right? And that's probably what I will be labeling there. But the way it's written is with a B sharp, and that's because of the melodic motion. So clearly Brahms here is dealing with this ascending scale that's basically trying to do a contrary motion. We have a descending scale, and in this counter subject we have this ascending scale. Right. And the interesting thing is that this is a chromatic one, while the top one is diatonic. So we have here the diatonic scale, and here we have the chromatic scale. And they're just going into this contrary motion. Right. So the chord that we would have here is probably this 4 with 9, right? And the accidental that's appearing there is primarily justified by the melodic motion. This takes us to a second chord, which is quite normal. Then we have a dominant 7th, and it's a very beautiful thing that achieves Brahms, because normally dominants are played like this, but Brahms introduces this modal feeling of a mixolydian scale, where we have the subtonic, and really here we get both. So we have this minor 7th and then the major 7th, and then that's resolving. So by doing this, Brahms is really trying to erase a little bit the tonal feeling of a traditional cadence, the way we know it, and introduces a very interesting modal color. So I'll put it here. Modal and mixolydian is really what we're hearing. Right. Then we have here a tonic, and it has a 9th, which is this appoggiatura in the 4th. So it's with a double appoggiatura. I'll highlight these two. They're just a double appoggiatura, and then they resolve into the tonic as a normal. So basically the chord progression is very traditional. What we have is a tonic, two predominant chords, a dominant and a tonic with a prolongation. So all of this can be viewed as a tonic prolongation, because there isn't a very strong cadence. There is this imperfect cadence because the tonic is presented here with the top note being the 3rd. And in a way, the main concept is just to present the tonality and to support it by, well, restating the tonic. So this is what the tonic prolongation is all about. So we have this E major that's basically prolongated through this progression. Right, almost like a pedal point. Right, but we have some motion. So it's inevitable to look into this bass and realize that there is a characteristic interval. It's not just random scales that are just going without any direction. So what are these notes, or what are they doing here? We're having little spans of fourths. So we have here a perfect fourth, and then this fourth is repeated again a step higher. So the interval of a fourth is really important. We'll be seeing it a lot, and I'll probably be using some arrows to highlight it. Let me find a suitable color. Let's use green. So we'll be using green arrows to highlight all of the perfect fourths. We have them here, E to A, F sharp to B, it's another fourth. And let's continue looking further. We can see here an inverted fourth, right? That goes like that. And also it's an imitation of this fourth in the top line. Almost like an augmentation. So those are the main motions. We have diatonic scales, which we'll be labeling with red. We will be using, for chromatic scale, let's use blue. That's going to be clearer, more contrasting. And green will be the fourth. Those are the three ingredients that Brahms is using for this piece. So we have three main motivic, or not even motivic, melodic materials that Brahms is going to be using. Number one is a scale, diatonic. Two is a chromatic scale. And three is a perfect fourth. So those are the ingredients, and we'll be giving each of them a different color. We have red, blue, and green. Now, the interesting thing is that Brahms is basically building the entire piece, or most of it, through these ingredients. So what we will do right now is pause a little bit the melodic analysis that the harmonic analysis, and we'll just embark on this task of trying to find out where are these ingredients appearing, right? Probably I might be missing some, so if you find any more instances of these, please write that in the comment section. So clearly we have a chromatic scale in the bass, like this, and it's also accompanied by the tenor line. Right, so there we have these two ascending scales. There is a little bit of a chromaticism here, right? And it also goes down, right? But I mean, the smaller ones probably aren't that interesting as the very big ones. So here we have yet another instance of a chromatic scale. And in the bass, I think those fourths are very prominent and they're very clear. So let's keep highlighting them. We have F sharp to B, that's a fourth. And by the way, here, this E, B to E, it's also fourth. All we have is just this inversion, which is a fifth. So we could be technically including fourth and fifth together because they're the inversion. But well, for now, maybe if we do that, we could use a different color. So let's use a darker kind of green for the fifths. And that way we can probably see much more. So let's continue. We have here the B. Of course, going back to F sharp, it's a fourth, right? And it's also going up. So it's another fourth. That's another fourth. And if I'm not mistaken, here we have a fourth. And then it's also present here. And we might get the fifths, which are these. That's the fifths, and this is a fifth. Right. Now, let's look into the scales. We should be finding the chromatic scales. There is a chromatic scale that's happening here. There is another one there. And theoretically, well, it's repeating the same part. So that's pretty much it for the first section, AA, but really the material or the motion as such is kept throughout all of the first page. So let's first analyze the harmony that we have here, and then we will be moving towards A, B. So harmonically, we saw this tonic prolongation. We didn't write it down, but we'll put tonic prolongation, which is happening right there. And let's continue with the harmony. The tonic is presented here inverted. So for inversions, we'll be using letters. That's going to be 1C. Then again, this chord, which is the minor with the ninth that we were labeling there. Probably for this specific chord, there are more interpretations. So be happy to hear from you if you have any other suggestions on how that chord can be done. But really the important thing is that all of this is a predominant chord that goes to a dominant and then takes us back to the tonic. So we should never forget about that structural importance of what's going on. Now, here we have a dominant of the dominant with the seventh and its N second inversion. Then it's taken to root position and takes us to a dominant seventh. Right. So there are just two small things that I want to highlight here that are, I believe, relevant in our discussion. What we have is a little clash of contrapuntal motion, and I think Brahms did it on purpose. I mean, it's not something that you would get by a chance, and is this minor second. So it's a dissonant clash that is representing two types of motion. We have the chromatic ascending direction, and at the same time we have that descent. So the real notes or tones are E, F sharp, A sharp. That's the dominant seventh chord. Whereas the E sharp is just an appoggiatura, in this case even a neighbor tone, is just neighboring the F sharp. So we have this, and through that we get this very dissonant chord. Right, and then we have another beautiful appoggiatura, which is the fourth, goes to the third, similar to this. Right, so the 4 to the 3, that appoggiatura, it's a classic, and Brahms really likes it. So structurally, what are the important notes? Well, the most important note definitely is the note of arrival, which is a half cadence. So we have here a half cadence, and it's very common for a period to end the first two phrases with half cadence. Well, and after that, we're starting the next part, which will have the perfect cadence. So if we want to do a harmonic reduction, we first have the tonic, and then we have the tonic moving, and it goes to the dominant, right? And the process of going to the dominant is through a secondary dominant, which is the 5 of 5. Right, once that is established, the music is taken a step higher, and by doing that, the tonic, originally first degree, now becomes second degree, because we're taking it one step higher. So we have here the second degree. It goes to a dominant seventh chord, but in this case it's a dominant ninth in minor chord. So the dominant seventh is this, dominant ninth would be that, and really here what we have is a minor chord without the fifths, which is that. Very modern sounding, and again quite close to that mixolydian feel we've described earlier. Brahms really was into modal exploration in his later years, and that's why we're finding so many instances of this subtonic seventh degree. Right, but then it takes us to this little cadence on top of the second degree. So we would have the second degree here, and we have the dominant of the second, and also the second of the second. So really all of this can be viewed as a predominant, dominant, and tonic in the key of F sharp minor. right? So we have here this little cadence. It's an imperfect cadence, imperfect authentic cadence in F sharp minor. F sharp minor being the second degree, and that's why we're labeling all of this from the second. Now, here, by the way, I've labeled seventh, but it's not a seventh, it's a ninth. And it's a ninth that actually brings a very interesting sound because it's this Phrygian chord. We have the flat feeling, the flat ninth, right? And then it goes to the dominant, again with the minor and major thirds. We have the minor and the major. And then that eventually leads us to, which is a transposition of, right, the previous bar. Really, what Brahms does here, and I can actually copy this with a yellow color, it's a direct transposition of the original four phrases. So there is not much difference between how it's presented done the first time and the second. There we stretch this, and the second time it's copied a second higher. So it's a sequence. We have a repetition a second above. Repetition a second higher. Right. Now, how is the cadence achieved? Well, in the cadence we have this chord, which in reality is a dominant of G. And G can be viewed as a Neapolitan of F sharp minor. So if we are still in that F sharp minor feel, that's the dominant of the Neapolitan. Or it's also the augmented sixth chord. In this case, the German augmented sixth. So we'll be writing it as German plus 6. Now, the augmented sixth chord, remember, it's a chord that is done if you take the dominant of a key. In this case, it's F sharp minor. So the dominant of F sharp minor would be C sharp. And with that dominant, what we do is we take a half step higher and lower. So a half step above and a half step below. And these two combined create the outline for the chord. In this case, a dominant seventh chord. So that would be the augmented sixth chord of F sharp minor. Right? Traditionally it would work like that. In this case, Brahms takes the chord, but gives it an exceptional resolution to a dominant of the tonic. So that's going to be the 5 of E major. Here that would be in F sharp minor. And this is the 5 of E major. And from there, we have this very beautiful chord, which is a double suspension, but really, if we're looking already into what's happening as a cadence, is the 6th degree, or we can see it directly from C sharp. It's the tonic, B in first minor, the 5, and the 1. That's viewed from C sharp. Right, so let's summarize it. So what is that chord? That chord has an appoggiatura, a chromatic passing tone in this case, and also a suspension, which is the F sharp that's being suspended. And that together creates the sound that then resolves into that. And then we have the cadence, right? It's not actually a perfect authentic cadence. I need to apologize for that. It's an imperfect because we have the 5th on top. So that 5th is making it imperfect. If we would have a perfect cadence, it would sound like this. Right, which it's quite uncommon in Brahms, because Brahms really liked more to create this tonal ambiguity, and well, that's why he is picking for the imperfect cadence. Right, let's continue. So once this is ending, there is this sense of repetition in an echo-like form. So what Brahms does is he takes these 3 chords, and from there, the new section is the beginning with that motif. And it's a very interesting technique. So compositionally, if we were to just imitate this into any piece, like modeling it, we would have a phrase that's presenting, in this case, a period with all of this coherent motion, and then the way we end the phrase becomes at the same time the way we start or begin the next phrase or section. And that's quite something, because then Brahms is not just doing this once, he then does variations on top of that motif. Originally it's just this, but then it's with a dominant seventh, right? And then this becomes this new chord, right? So we will highlight that probably with orange. We can see also that being repeated twice. Right, so what is happening while those motifs are not playing? Well, in the gaps, we have this polyrhythm or 3 against 2, very common in Brahms. So this polyrhythm, it's very characteristic. And in this case, it's just highlighting a perfect cadence in F sharp major. So let's, in C sharp major. Let's just put the harmony first. So here we have an A-B, and we'll put it with blue. So we have C sharp major. We already said that that's a parallel key of the relative. And we have a period that in this case is open, it doesn't answer, it doesn't finish, and it's basically 5 bars. So we have 5 that's organized in 2 plus 3, where we have 1 plus 1 and 1 plus 2. We'll now see what that means. So the red motif, which was the cadence of the previous section, AA, becomes now the opening idea. And this opening idea is presented here, then we have it again, and it's answered by a closing idea or a contrasting idea. So the first time it's contrasting, we have just this little contrast. Let's highlight it. And then we have a closing idea, which in reality doesn't fully close, because what it does, it's just restating this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Really, it's 4. It has a prolongation there. Right. So this is how we would be looking into this. Now, harmonically, and this is where the things are probably very clear. So the first section, AA, was characterized by this chromatic motion, whereas here mostly it's all diatonic. So it's very diatonic harmony. Remember that diatonic doesn't mean that we just have natural keys, like the normal keys on a key signature, but it also can be the natural notes in a different scale. In this case, in C sharp major, we have all of the accidentals that need to be added, but it's all diatonic. So when we listen to this, it's all very diatonic. So let's see what is this. Really, I'm starting to realize that we've used the red color for the pivot notes in the harmony, so I'll apologize and we'll change the color here. Let's give this maybe blue, and we'll be using still red for the other things. So blue will be, this is a very clear blue, we need slightly darker one, maybe this, yeah. So that was the motif, and with the red we need to highlight the main notes in the bass. So we had here the F sharp, the second degree, which is just prolongating, and then it goes to C sharp, which is this note. So those are the pivot notes in the bass. E to B and F sharp to C sharp, whereas the top notes are opposite. Right? They're going like that. That would be the harmonic reduction at its maximum from what we're having. So I can also highlight these notes in the top melody. Right, so now going to this part, really what we have is a tonic prolongation of C sharp. C sharp is staying here, and then it all deviates or moves to a diminished chord, which creates ambiguity. Right, so that's the diminished, unstable ambiguity. Right, and technically this is the climax or climactic point of section 8. So within section 8, this is the point of arrival. We have this forte. We look into dynamics. Brahms was really careful here. He wrote piano at the beginning. We stay all the time piano, and then towards that section is where we get forte, which is the climactic point. Right, harmonically, it's all very clear. We have 1, we've got 4, we've got the dominant with the cadential 4/6 and the tonic. So I won't be really elaborating much more on that. And here we have the minor tonic, a little modulation, because it's the minor 4th, sorry, going to the A major. And really it sounds like we are going to cadence in A major. And from A major, that would be the 4th degree, sorry, the 6th degree, and the dominant. So what is A major? A major is the subdominant, right, the 4th degree. And in this case, it's taking us to this feel of unresolved or broken, interrupted progression, where we were expecting to have a cadence, but then it's just breaking. And that's really where we get to the diminished chord and the climactic point. Right, as you might remember, we were using these arrows to highlight diatonic scales and chromatic scales. So let's now do it in this section. First, we will look into the top line. So clearly there are some scales here. These are diatonic. Now they're ascending, right? So we here have the scale that goes up. Right, and it goes really up to the G if you want to see the line. So we have like this. That keeps going. And then we have this other little scale. Now, in the bass, we have the other interval, which was the 4th. So those 4ths are still present. Here we have a 5th. We'll now highlight it with the other color. Another 4th. And more 5ths. So let's use this darker hue for the 5ths. And here we have the 5ths. Right, and then from E, which is this really unstable point, we go to B, right, which is another 4th. It's a larger scale 4th, so I'll highlight it like this, but it's there also connecting. Right, so in terms of range, we also can see that this is sounding higher, so we have a higher range, and that gives us contrast. And when we arrive to the climactic section, really what we can clearly see is this contrary motion that's taking us through the diminished chord. Which theoretically, well, it's a combination of both diatonic and chromatic motion, because a diminished scale is like this, right, where we're combining both diatonic and chromatic. And this would be probably the most awkward C major chord you have ever seen in terms of notation. Brahms is really writing the notes C major, right? But it's written as B sharp, E, and F double sharp. So many of you might be thrown off by what is this C major, right? And I think that this was a conscious choice. So Brahms really knew what he was doing. He knows that C major is generally regarded as the simplest chord. Everyone generally looks into that chord as, well, something very cliche, and composers in the Romanticism really were looking into more complex harmonies. But in this case, the C major chord has nothing to do with the actual key of C major, but rather it's a diminished chord, which we'll now look into the spelling because it's spelled with double sharps, and it's the result of the contrary motion that's happening between two notes of the diminished chords. We're just connecting those two notes with a passing tone, and that way we get C major, which is happening like this. All right, now that passing chord, it's already explained, but how is the diminished one spelled? So the diminished, in this case, it's spelled with F double sharp being the root of the chord. When we have that, that implies a dominant underneath, which is D sharp. So really this is the seventh diminished, seventh of G sharp minor, right? And G sharp minor really will be the key that we'll have here. Right? So Brahms is taking or anticipating through this motion the dominant of the section B, right? And he could have actually started from this. Which is basically the resolution, natural resolution of that chord. But it's not happening. So what we have is a recapitulation. All right, let's now look into this A prime. So A prime really, it's very similar in a way to the beginning, but at the same time it has some of the most interesting compositional devices. So the first thing that Brahms does, and it's the repetition of the beginning, is that the voices are different. So let's look again at the beginning. This is how it was written. And now I want you to look into the bass. Right? So really, what did we hear? Actually, it's not a repetition of the beginning, right? We heard the repetition of this motif. Let's put it in pink. Everything we had it here with this pink color. I'll put it maybe with another layer. And it's almost like Brahms says, all right, you already heard the beginning. You've heard it actually 2 times. I'm gonna start my recapitulation removing the opening idea directly through the contrasting. And this is a very advanced compositional technique that not works with all phrases or sentences and periods. In this case, it does work because what we have is this homophonic texture, right, which will be really contrasting with the next one. So it's homophonic, which means we have these block chords, but with counterpoint. And remember, by the way, I didn't write this, that the form is ternary. So that homophonic texture has such a clear logic that we can just remove one of the phrases and play the second one and it still makes sense. And that's really what's happening here. So we start with the second phrase. And then we hear the third one the same way it was written. Right? That's an inversion of the roles. So if we're looking into the music from this perspective, now the contrasting idea becomes opening. So contrasting idea becomes the opening idea, and the old opening idea that was repeated becomes now a contrasting idea, right? And I know, but you can think of this from all sorts of pieces. Let's just maybe take Mozart's alla turca. So it's almost like Mozart would say, all right, this is my presentation, and in the recap, I'll directly start here. And then continue there. So there it clearly doesn't seem to work because the music is quite connected or not so well articulated, so the contrasting section would work by itself. But here Brahms does it seamlessly. And when we hear this, it's clearly feeling like the right recapitulation. Right? And then it continues. And all of this is now leading us towards a new climactic point, which is this. So let's examine it. We have a dominant chord, which is the dominant, similar to this technique where Brahms was just adding a dominant seventh, which is the dominant of the fourth. I didn't write it here, but that would be the dominant of the fourth. And here Brahms is doing the tonic, same, which is dealt as the dominant of the fourth. There we go. And that is not resolving where it should. So this chord should resolve naturally to A major. And what Brahms does is he takes it to this chord. And that is one of the most interesting and fascinating chords. This chord actually is called, outside the classical music, in jazz music they call it the bebop chord, because it's a dominant 13 chord. It's F13. What we would have is that chord, which is there with that major seventh between the 7th of the chord and the 13th of the chord. Clearly Brahms doesn't just work with this chord as a solo chord, but he is dealing with this as an appoggiatura. So it's the 6th that goes to the 5th, right, that motion. But still, it's quite interesting, right? So what is happening in the bass? The bass is clearly dealing with the chromatic motion. For chromatic, if I'm not mistaken, we're using blue. So the bass is here, well, working with that chromatic scale. And we're arriving into a very complex harmony. We have F13. What is F13? It's the dominant of the B flat. It's the dominant of B flat major. Now, B flat major is the tritone. It's the furthest harmonic point we can imagine. If you're thinking of it, we have E major as the tonic. It has 4 sharps. The inversion of that in terms of the circle of fifths is B flat major with 2 flats. And they're separated by this tritone or diminished fifth. Right, so that is happening here. But it's also, F is the Neapolitan. F is the Neapolitan of E major, right? So this double relationship that we have it's really what's fascinating. And after that, we get a step higher to a D major, again written very interestingly because this D major chord is written as G flat with D. Right, so what is this? It's all a prolongation of the same chord. This all F sharp dominant chord. It's all this F sharp Neapolitan, right? Sorry, not F sharp, F natural Neapolitan. So I'll be using the same technique we had previously, which is the red. We start now with B because that's where the half cadence happened, and that takes us to F sharp, which is there, right? So by the way, here I didn't highlight it, but this is a prolongation of B and F sharp. It's also interesting to notice how, and this is something I didn't really mention the first time, but I'll put here with the blue color. So we have the chromatic motif. It's in a way, it's not directly, but it's in a way transmitted here. And that's also partly why the second contrasting phrase still sounds or works like a recapitulation, because we have this chromatic motif, ascending motif, repeated, right? And it's also always like between top and bottom line. We have it above, we have in the bass. then it's here, and then it's in the bass. Right, so now it's, and now it's there, E, F, G flat. That's why we're getting that motion. And then it happens once more with F, F sharp, and G. Like that. And so those are the two main chromatic scales. All right, now that was the prolongation of the dominant seventh chord. And we can explain all of the notes that are happening here. So you want to say, like, what is the G flat? Well, it's the flat 9. Right, so what is the D? It's the 13th. What is the E flat? It's the 7th. A is 3rd. What is the C? It's the 5th. D, 6th. Right? Then those are all the notes we have. And Brahms basically knows how just move around for, in this case, 6 chords and still make it sound or feel like we're having mainly just, well, one single chord. So this is also called emiola. Emiola is where when the rhythmic feel or time signature is shifted, and in this case, instead of feeling the 3/4 time signature, we have a 2/4 meter. It's a double meter where we have 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Right. Let's see if there was any other instance of this at the beginning, because I believe there might have been. Well, it's clearly at the beginning happening too. We have this 1, 2, 1, 2. So I want to highlight it too. Is this? It's feeling almost like 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Right. It's also a hemiola. Tonic prolongation and hemiola that we didn't put here. Right, and the hemiola, it's happening many times here because if you look into the bass, it's very much felt like a 2/4 time signature most of the time, I would say. So Brahms is in a way arguing or playing with the traditional sense of what a time signature is and shifts this rhythmic feel into instability. And really it's felt from here, like this is 3/4, normal 3/4, but it's shifted. 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. All right, so more hemiolas. Well, we had there. Those are hemiolas. Yeah. I wrote 2/4 meter. Let me, oh, right, I'm adding lines, I've noticed. I'll remove this and put here hemiola. All right, so what do we have more? Well, there was this motif, contrary scale, and now Brahms in a way is playing still with that sort of texture. So I'll highlight it. It's very similar because what we have now is the motion that's chromatic above and below, and they're just going in opposite directions. Let me see if it seems like it freezed a little bit. All right, going back. So down, and this is going up. All right, and diatonically, there are also many scales that we need to highlight. We have this. That's diatonic contrary motion, and we also have this, which is moving upwards diatonically. Right, which is taking us to the third. This is also an imperfect cadence, imperfect authentic cadence in E major, but this time the imperfect cadence lands on a third. So we had the first important cadence landing on the fifth. Now it lands on a third. And I'm assuming that when we hear G sharp here, it becomes tonic. So these are like 3 ways you can harmonize the same note, and it's a master class by Brahms. You can harmonize it as a tonic. You can harmonize it as the third. which is here, and you can harmonize it as the fifths. So as a fifth, as a tonic, and as a third and as a tonic. And that would be as a tonic. And it's the same G sharp, which is really fascinating and interesting. So now we have to explain the harmony of this passage. So here, really, Brahms is playing with a little bit of E minor, which is the minor tonic. Then he has the dominant and major tonic. And the chord we have before that, which is this, it's a chromatic chord. It's just the dominant of the third degree. Right? But I would not really look into it as that, but more like as a passing chord from F to E minor. Right? Which is really what's happening there. So it's a neighbor tone that we have there that's creating this chord. So it's neighbor chord. And really what Brahms does is here a modal exchange. So we have minor tonic that goes to major. And it's exactly the same type of procedure we had here. Right? So Brahms really liked that sort of cadential process. And for that reason, we will be giving this a blue color. The same blue color. Right? That was the first time and then the second. We heard there both. I'll remove actually the green there. Good. And once that cadence is happening, all we get is a reharmonization of the G sharp as the second inversion of the sixth degree. Right? And this is the pivot chord. And it's probably one of the most subtle ways I've seen to modulate from E major to G sharp minor. So we have E major, and we're just hanging on that cadential. We would expect this, but he's just hanging there. You can imagine in your head the cadence, but it's happening. And the next section begins. Right? So let's summarize briefly what we had here. We had a section with the modulation to the relative key, the parallel relative key, the relative key being established at C sharp, and then from there we go back to E major. In a way, the tonal plan is that. And it's the inversion of that interval what happens on a larger scale. So on a larger scale, we have E major, G sharp minor, E major. But on a smaller scale, it's this. And that type of relationship is what we call mediant relationship. So we have E in the middle. Underneath that we have C sharp. Above that we have G sharp, sorry. And what Brahms does is he moves up and down depending on what structural level we are. If we're on the largest structural level, we're going higher, and if we're on a smaller one, we're going down to C sharp. Right, now let's examine what's happening really into the section B. Section B is probably one of the most beautiful pieces of Brahms's piano literature, so I'll just start by playing it. Masterful. So what is happening? We have two big sections, so to speak, within B, which are variations. So we can use maybe this line. I believe we were using orange last time to divide the sections. So we can say this is B1 or B prime, B1, BA, and then it's repeated here with a variation. So we have B1 prime, right? The most important thing or most significant thing of the variation is the trochee or the inversion of the melody that initially was in the top line. So now it becomes a middle voice, middle part. And that was originally here, the descending melody. Right, there are a lot of things that can be said about this, but first let's begin by the most obvious, which is the silences. There are a lot of silences that we really didn't have in the first section, and if I'm not mistaken, there is not a single silence in all of the first section. So that's the first major point of contrast. And I, as my PhD was written on the topic of silences, I really feel compelled to draw your attention to that. Now, these silences are primarily creating a rhythm, right? I won't be highlighting all of them, I'll just do it in section 8 so we can see them. They're creating a rhythm that is a double meter. So we have a 2/4 meter, which is a hemiola, and it's created by these rests and, well, the descending, the texture of the accompaniment. Now, how is Brahms making this piece contrasting? So what we'll be doing is we'll just do two columns here. We'll be saying on the one thing, the contrast, and on the other column we'll be putting the things that, well, Brahms makes similar, right? And I think by doing this analysis, you all will be able to see the masterfulness of how to create a piece where you're at the same time changing things and also keeping them similar. So let's look into the contrast. As far as contrast goes, we have triplets. We didn't have them. We have a texture of accompanied melody. We have silences or rests. And there is the arpeggios. Arpeggios were non-existing in the first section. What are things that are similar? We have the hemiola, right? The hemiola is the same as at the beginning. So let's maybe use green color for this. All right, we have the hemiola. We have a descending scale. I want to address this, but I think, well, if you look carefully, we had that scale descending, and now the scale just becomes the main element, right? So the descending melody, it's taken from section 8. It's the same, right? Now, more things that are similar. Well, clearly there is this game of 3 against 2. So the 3 against 2 rhythm was present for the first time in this. Right? And Brahms, in a way, is repeating it here in many places, right? So that is a very interesting element. We can highlight it here, 3 against 2. Right, more things that we can see. Well, the fact that we have a sequence, right? So remember that in the beginning, the melody was initially presented at one step and then it was taken a little bit higher. This is similar to what we have here. Right, so it's basically a transposition higher of a melody. So we have higher transposition. Also the type of form that Brahms is using is a period. So through that period, we can see all of these repetitions. Let's highlight the period with the opening ideas. We're using yellow, so maybe now we can use a slightly different color as yellow was taken for the rest. But we have this opening idea, which is this. Right, I'm not sure, maybe I'll just highlight it with arrows or lines. So we have the opening idea that is presented here, and then it's repeated again here, right? So this is our opening idea. And if you look into the bass, or the second half, we have similar presentation here and here. So those are the 4 times that the opening idea is presented. Now, this is a thing of contrast. So here we don't have no contrasting section, middle section. In the first section in A, we did have that. We had A, BA inside, but right now it's just one presentation, B1 or BA, and it's repeated again. So that's something. And then the repetition of these ideas, it's really what makes it very interesting. So I've highlighted them with squares. It doesn't look extremely clean, but well, I'll try to do my best. All right. Now, let's examine the harmony, because the harmony here is extremely diatonic. There are almost no chromatic notes. If we look into this, I believe that there is not a single chromatic note, at least that I can see. So it's all extremely diatonic, and that makes this section very contrasting. So we'll add here more things to the contrasting list. We can put maybe some of these things in 2 lines. So we have diatonic harmony, no chromatic tone, passing tones, neighbor tones, and all of those non-chord tones, right? And that's why harmonically this is going to be one of the simplest analyses we'll be doing, because it's mostly everything is in root position. This is a tonic. I'll be labeling it with the same way we did it before. So it's tonic, then we have the 6th degree, we have as the rhythm, we have the 4th degree, and that's taking us to the dominant, and there we're staying. So it's a half cadence, right? It's a half cadence that's happening there. And then same harmony, we have a tonic, all very clean. This is the 6th degree, this is the 4th degree, and then that's taking us to the 2nd. So here's where something very cool and very interesting happens. Brahms is like expanding the harmony beyond what is the conventional, and we get to have these very interesting sounds. And it's all because of the most important interval that's happening here, and it's the descending third. The descending third, and this descending third can be explained in the first section. If you remember, the first section was E major descending to C sharp. We were going to C sharp. So now that concept of descending third now is taken at multiple levels. We have it at a minimal level, so that would be, maybe we can use pink for this. We have it at the level of the accompaniment, that's that third, right, descending third. But we also have the descending thirds at a larger level, where the bass notes are descending by thirds. First, it's just done to get to C sharp, which is the predominant that takes us to D. But then it's done to take us really down, and we're getting to the dominant diatonically, right? Right, and that's basically a very clear and clean chord progression. In both cases, we arrive to the same place because we have a tonic predominant in a dominant, which is making a half cadence. And here we also have a tonic predominant and dominant, but it's dealt very differently. So in one way it's through this motion, and the second time is through descending thirds. Right? That's why probably it's one of the most interesting and harmonically perplexing passages of Brahms. And he continues with a third, so it's not like he just does them there. Here they're presented, so since that's a variation of the first phrase, and here we have them presented again here. So let's try to make sense of the overall harmonic progression. We have, well, the structural part, sorry. So we have this repeated 4 times. And the first time it's arriving to a half cadence. Then we have yet another half cadence, yet another half cadence, and finally we have a perfect authentic cadence. And this is the only perfect authentic cadence we had so far, because remember the other one that I've mislabeled as perfect authentic was not really such. It was an imperfect cadence. So here we have this perfect authentic cadence. And it's interesting that Brahms really deals with the perfect authentic cadence with one of the most unique ways we have seen. So is the cadential 4/6. That would be what maybe Schumann would do or Beethoven, no? But Brahms is staying on this cadential 4/6. Then the dominant becomes suspended and then results into a unison. So it's a very fascinating and unique. And we have this tonic, right? Or we can put the cadential 4/6 as this. Then we have the 5/4 with suspension. And the suspension goes into tonic unison, no harmony whatsoever. So in spite of being a perfect authentic cadence, and it has all of the ingredients for being such, it's a very weak or soft one because Brahms tries to soften a little bit that feel and doesn't present the most important thing, the leading tone going to the tonic, right? So that's about that perfect authentic cadence. Right, so I'm gonna now highlight with red the most important harmonic points. So we have G sharp, dominant, then again tonic, and dominant, the dominant, and finally we have the perfect cadence. Right, and the other thing I wanted to highlight is something very interesting about the melody. So in the melody, if you look carefully, you will realize that Brahms is doing a diminution. So this is a diminution of the main motif, and at the same time is a fragmentation. So diminution means that Brahms is speeding up. So this was going in quarter notes. Now this is 2/8, right? And the fragmentation is because we had initially these 5 notes going down, and now we're just taking 3. Right? So it's a very beautiful compositional device that's usually done for contrasting sections, and that's what we're getting there. And then the diminution continues. And here we have the interval that we were really looking for, which is the 4th, right? So here is that 4th appearing again, right? I don't remember which color we were using. Diatonic was red, so yeah, we can use this now. So the red line is this diatonic scale. I mean, there shouldn't be any blue lines because it's all very diatonic in this section. The only chromatic chord we get is this. This is the only chromatic chord. Everything else can be explained from G sharp minor, natural, or harmonic the scales, right? Harmonic would explain the F sharp, F double sharp. So the force is there, and we have this descending scale. We have it going up, also descending. Here it's pretty much the same, right? And here we have the one of the few moments where the scale is like in a dialogue. So we have ascending motion and we have descending motion. And Brahms is doing this consciously, so we get this dialogue between the top and the bottom. So really what we have is the motif like being transferred between the low and the high parts, and it's going in opposite direction. Like this can be almost like a dialogue between a soprano, and then here we have a tenor. And then the soprano answers. Tenor, soprano, tenor, soprano. Right? Actually, I want to highlight this somehow, but well, I think it's quite clear. So, and there are already a lot of things on this course. I don't want to make it look too clumsy. All right, just to sum up the section, let's do this structural outline. If I'm not mistaken, I want to double check the bars, but we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we have 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 6. That would be 12 plus 6, 18 bars. That's the section. 18, which are organized in 8 plus 10, right? So what we will do is we'll try to understand how are these sections built. The first section, which is 8, which is here, ending, we have 8, which are divided in 4 plus 4. Each of them is 2 plus 2. Right? And that would mean that we would have an opening idea, which is highlighted with the orange. That opening idea is repeated. And we have a contrasting idea is here. And we have a cadential idea. This is the same structure that we had in section A1. So opening idea, 2 bars, contrasting idea, 2 bars, opening idea repeated, now actually repeated identically. So the sequence was here with the transposition almost like fooling us, because Brahms takes the melody higher, but it's for doing a pickup. And the melody in essence is the same. These 2 bars are identical. Right, they're the same. So then after that we have a cadence, and this cadential idea is ending with a half cadence. So we'll put it half cadence, which is an opening feeling. Right. Non-conclusive, that's what I want to say. So non-conclusive. And here we have the same. So we're having a repetition of these, but there's an augmentation or prolongation towards the end. So we have 10 bars, which are divided into 4 inside 2 plus 2, and 6. These 6 are 2 plus 4, which are basically that dialogue. So that would be the cadential idea. This is the repetition of the opening. And this is the opening idea. And there we have the closing. Well, so the contrasting. All right. Important things about this. As you can see, Brahms repeats 4 times the orange motif, but here he applies really the technique that we can see in Haydn. So Haydn was one of these classical composers whose music is quite well known for repetitions, but he had a very clear rule that was, if you repeat something 3 times, the 3rd time you have to do it different. And interestingly enough, here Brahms does the change exactly on the third time. And there are actually two changes that he does. So he changes the direction of the arpeggios, is now ascending, which is also an important fact. We didn't highlight that. Well, maybe we can do it with some arrows. We can see the arpeggios are going now up. Initially, they were all going down. And the second thing is the octave leap. So we have the melody an octave lower. Now it becomes the middle part. Now, Brahms only changes direction for this part, which is the third section. So he retakes and does again the same texture as the beginning with this added pickup. And that way the motif feels fresh or new, because when we're hearing it this time, it doesn't feel like the third repetition, but it feels like a recapitulation. So it creates a recap feeling. Because first we have something restated twice the same way, then we have this inversion or contrast, and then we have again the same one. And then the fragmentation is just a dialogue between those two directions. If you can see it, well, it's the scales going up when it's in the tenor and going down when it's in the soprano voice. And really I refer to these as tenor and soprano mainly because Brahms in his music was really very vocal. A lot of the pieces that Brahms wrote over his life were actually vocal music. So that lyricism, that vocal quality can be seen in this music. Right, I mean, we could stay and keep talking much more about this, but since we want to keep the video within a manageable time frame, probably we'll be closing this section and quickly just overviewing and doing a short explanation of the ending. So there are two things we need to see here. First, there's a coda, right? The coda is the end. And this coda is quite fascinating because it's basically working with the similar materials we had there. So if you look into the melody, I think it's the same melody. And well, we have that fragmentation, which we were putting with the green. So in a way, Brahms is restating section B, but it's presented in E major, right? So that's a main difference. So it's material from section B, but with the tonic. And actually it's material from both sections B. So it's from section AB, which is these arpeggios, and from section, well, B1 or B1 prime, it's the same. So AB, remember that was this, right? We have those arpeggios, and they're clearly now here. So we have, and the writing is very coherent. I mean, harmonically, all it does is this E major, but there are a lot of interesting things that are happening at the same time. So let's briefly highlight them. Firstly, there is the descending scale that was present there, and it's also present at this level, right? Which is basically going down to E. We have the fourth or quartal motion here, right? Which is taking us to E major. And that is done very beautifully over a cadence that's basically this dominant, which has the 13th, has the 7th, has the 9th, so it's a very extended dominant. But the way Brahms resolves it is like everything becomes suspension. So basically he has the dominant on top of the tonic. First the 7th resolves to the 3rd, and then the 9th resolves to the tonic. So we have this double suspension, 9 to the octave and 7th to the 6th. And that's the tonic. So that is the only perfect authentic cadence in the tonic that we have here. first and only perfect, authentic cadence in the tonic. And all of that is done through a very elegant writing, because the music is like going downwards, and then all of a sudden we have this raising arpeggio that's moving upwards, which is there, right? So it goes from the bottom till the top, and also it's played once more there, like that. Right, more things. We have some chromatic motion. I think the chromatic motion is equally interesting because firstly we were not seeing it in the B section that much, but now it is present. And those chromatic notes basically they just enrich a little bit the harmony. So harmonically we have the fourth degree that goes to the second, right? And then that second actually has a little bit of some chromatic motion that D natural that creates almost a feel of a dominant seventh in A major. Right. So it's this, right? And then we have the dominant of the dominant. That eventually just goes to the dominant, normal dominant, and tonic. Well, sorry, this is not dominant of the dominant, just the dominant, normal dominant. Right, and that dominant is just going to the tonic. So where is the dialogue that I wanted to highlight? Here it is. So there is a dialogue between higher and lower voices. We have this little canon. So we have right, eventually it's like the bottom part transferred to the top and it's played by augmentation. So here we have an augmentation. Right, and those would be primarily the main techniques. Brahms is playing just a scale that goes from E to E in the top. And he's also playing it here. Right, so that's like a double descending scale. It's almost creating a canon, right? So we could highlight it with some lines, like it starts here, and the other one actually begins there, and they're going both down to a lower note. In this case, well, E is there, and here the scale actually leads into D sharp, right? But we still have the scale from E to E as the main scale, I would say. All right, so I wouldn't say much more about the coda. It's a very little beautiful addition, but it's done in a masterful way, such that it's combining in a way a recapitulation of B, a recapitulation of B1, and it also has a very simple chord progression. It's predominant, dominant, and tonics, just three tonal functions. Right, now what is happening here in A prime is really interesting, because Brahms is in a way, well, trying to create something new, and he is overlapping both A sections that he had at the beginning. Let's see if we can kind of do this. So we have the original A, which is this, repeated until here. That's the original A. That's what we can say. It's A, A. And then we have at the same time A prime, A and A prime presented there. And it's starting from this place. And it continues and carries until this F sharp, F natural. And what Brahms does is an augmentation or a standing, in this case not on the dominant, but it's a prolongation of F natural. So if we take that part as a prolongation, we can see that really after that Brahms continues with the same A prime. Let's kind of see it again in the score so you can see it better. So original A was this. And that's what Brahms basically copies here. So let's play it. A. Same. Right. And then we have on the other side A prime. So remember, A prime started here with the second contrasting idea. And it went then to the Neapolitan. And then through this transitional chord, it cadenced. So this A prime section, A prime, is starting right here. And Brahms is basically overlapping both to create a new section. So it's almost like Brahms had the original section, which was this A prime, which is the recap, and he decides in the first section at the beginning to present one snippet of it and then the other. And I think I haven't seen this technique in many other pieces. So just to understand it, the logic is that we start with a unit that is this, and then we decide the first time in AA do a little section, and then in AA prime do this other little section. And we never get to really hear the full section until we are in the recap. That's what's happening here. So I'll now put the labels to maybe clarify it. Yeah, there we go. So this would be the large scale A prime, which is what we're here on the end. This is original AA, and this is original A prime. And that's what is happening in this recapitulation. Now, of course, there are some changes, and now we will look into them, but primarily it's just the prolongation of the Neapolitan chord that we were missing. So Brahms is like doing this, if we want to see it. I'll maybe put another color. This could be maybe blue. Let's try to see if blue will be clearer, because I think this is very clear. Yeah, there we go. Blue is perfect. So with blue we'll see this. Yeah. So originally A was this, and here we have the Neapolitan prolongation. Neapolitan prolongation. But then the cadence is the same. And that's basically what's happening there in terms of structure. So let's look now into this Neapolitan prolongation. So basically A section A prime starts from here. I'll play it. As originally it sounded, it would be this. This is the same. And remember here, he was, I'll actually put it with yellow, doing this. Right, so he basically completes this gap. We didn't have it. So originally A prime was and then we went to this. Right, so there is a little diminution here at the end. But these sections are a prolongation, right? Of course, I've pointed with the pink line. I think it's a little bit ugly there, but well, we can put it cleaner in the middle. So that's the prolongation of the Neapolitan. But at the same time, there are new sections, and these I will now put with a pink square, are the ones that Brahms didn't have in the first presentation. And they are the new materials that are just basically creating the climactic section, or climax. Right. And what are they? They're the prolongation of the Neapolitan. Right. It's also interesting that they are presented by diminution in terms of rhythm, because we have a rhythmic device which is these eighth notes. And in a way they are very connected or tied to the descending thirds we were examining into the B section. So I want to highlight these. Remember these descending thirds? We have them here, so they're like that. They're descending thirds. And here we have even a higher progression. E flat, G flat, C, A, F, right? So it's all a progression of descending thirds that are just either neighbored through a neighbored tone or presented with the passing tones. Passing tone, neighbor, passing tone, and then we arrive eventually to the F. There is a little fourth here that breaks the progression, but well, the interval of the fourth was introduced earlier. So basically that will be it. This is the analysis. I hope you find this useful. I think this is a masterpiece. I would just play it to finish the analysis, just going over all of these things. And I want to, well, again, thank all of the patrons that are supporting this channel, and I would encourage you to become one if you are finding this material useful. Remember that you can learn or study composition with me on a one-on-one basis by sending an email. And also, well, I want to say that this piece is very dear to me because I remember analyzing it for the first time on an exam that I was doing on music analysis, and it was a special test that they did in order to award the highest grade at the higher conservatory. And I, well, successfully analyzed everything that you see here. And that was when I was 16 years old or 15. I don't quite remember exactly the age, probably 15. So this was a piece that I've analyzed, well, a long time ago, and I'm really happy now to go back over it and unfold all of these things. Probably there's much more into it because Brahms in his later stage in his career was really aware of all of the compositional techniques he was using, and he actually preferred to write these smaller pieces that were very polished, and he rewrote them multiple times, and well, we arrived at some of the most interesting and beautiful pieces that we have from the Romantic repertoire. So let's listen to this masterpiece, and with that I'm wishing you all a great and peaceful week.